A single BGM-109 Tomahawk Block V cruise missile cleared the forward vertical launch cell of the USS Philippine Sea, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser holding station in the central Persian Gulf, 140 nautical miles southwest of Bandar Abbas. The booster kicked it off the rail and fell away.
Wings deployed. The turbofan caught air.
And 1,600 pounds of guided American foreign policy dropped to 50 feet above the waterline and turned northeast at 550 miles per hour toward something the United States government had not publicly acknowledged existed. The target was not on any map distributed to coalition partners. Not in any Pentagon press briefing. Not in any leaked target list making the rounds on Telegram channels where Iranian state media pretended to have sources. The target was a hardened underground facility 11 kilometers east of Isfahan, buried 80 feet beneath a complex that satellite imagery showed as a pharmaceutical packaging plant. The kind of building nobody looks at twice.
Which was the entire point.
Because underneath it, according to 14 months of signals intelligence and one extraordinarily well-placed human source, Iran had been operating a cascade hall containing 1,044 IR-6 centrifuges enriching uranium to 60% purity. The Tomahawk cost $2.1 million. The centrifuge hall it was pointed at represented roughly $800 million in infrastructure, research, and 2 decades of sanctions evasion. Somewhere in the Navy's accounting office, someone was about to have a very satisfying afternoon. But the Tomahawk was not going to reach Isfahan. It was never supposed to. Its job was to die loudly, 340 nautical miles to the northwest, above the Iraqi border region. A formation of 8 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers was entering Iranian airspace at 42,000 feet. Each one carried 16 GBU, 57 massive ordnance penetrators in its rotary launchers, 30,000-pound bunker busters designed to punch through 200 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. At $3.5 million per bomb, the 8 aircraft together carried roughly $448 million worth of ordnance. The entire formation's radar cross-section registered on Iranian air defense screens as approximately nothing. The Tomahawk's job was simple: fly toward Isfahan making as much electromagnetic noise as a cruise missile can make. Let every radar between Bandar Abbas and the target track it, paint it, hand it off to the next battery. Let every Tor M1, every Bavar 373, every surviving S-300 crew orient their attention southeast. Let every phone call between IRGC air defense nodes carry the same message: incoming from the Gulf, bearing northeast, one target, track and engage. And while every antenna in western Iran stared at a $2.1 million decoy flying at 550 miles per hour, 8 aircraft worth $2 billion each would arrive from the opposite direction carrying enough penetrating ordnance to rearrange the geology beneath Isfahan. Iran was about to learn the difference between seeing the threat and seeing the distraction. 130 kilometers south of Isfahan, the Tomahawk crossed into the engagement envelope of an Iranian Bavar 373 battery. The domestically produced long-range air defense system Tehran had spent a decade calling superior to the Russian S-300. The system's engagement radar, a modified version of the Sayyad-4 missile's fire control set, detected the cruise missile at 112 kilometers. The battery commander did exactly what his training demanded. He acquired, tracked, transitioned to fire control, and launched 2 interceptors. Each Sayyad-4 missile cost approximately $3.8 million. 2 of them, $7.6 million, now racing toward a target worth $2.1 million. The math was already working against Iran and the real strike hadn't started yet. The Tomahawk didn't evade. It didn't need to. Its terrain-following algorithm kept it at 50 feet over the desert floor, which meant the Sayyad-4s had to execute a terminal dive against a target hugging the ground clutter. The first interceptor's proximity fuse triggered 40 meters above the cruise missile, peppering it with fragments that severed the left wing. The Tomahawk cartwheeled into the desert floor southeast of Najafabad at 3:27 local time.
Kill confirmed.
The Bavar 373 crew celebrated. Their command network buzzed with confirmation. Threat neutralized, single cruise missile, origin assessed as naval platform in the Persian Gulf. The battery commander reported the engagement up the chain and began the 6-minute reset cycle to reload. What he didn't know was that his radar had been transmitting continuously for 94 seconds during the engagement sequence, and 390 kilometers to the northwest, an RC-135V Rivet Joint Electronic Intelligence aircraft orbiting over Iraqi Kurdistan had recorded every emission with a precision that would make the battery's next minute of existence very brief. 9,000 feet above the Zagros ridgeline, a pair of F-15E Strike Eagles out of Al Dhafra were already turning. Their APG-82 radars had the Bavar 373's coordinates before the Tomahawk's wreckage stopped burning. Each Strike Eagle carried two AGM-88G ARGMER missiles, the extended range variant of the old HARM, capable of Mach 2.5 and 300 kilometers of reach against radiating targets. The weapons officer in the lead aircraft confirmed the emission signature against the rivet joint's data match. He selected both weapons. The missiles dropped off the pylons, boosters igniting, accelerating past twice the speed of sound within 4 seconds. Each ARGMER cost $1.2 million. 2 missiles, $2.4 million. Headed for a battery that cost Iran somewhere north of $300 million to develop and $40 million to produce. The Bavar 373 crew had exactly the amount of warning that a radar warning receiver provides when it isn't turned on because you just shot down a cruise missile and you're running the post-engagement checklist.
Which is to say, none.
The first ARGMER struck the engagement radar antenna. The second hit the command vehicle 30 meters away. The battery ceased to exist as a functioning air defense system at 3:31 local time, 4 minutes after it celebrated its kill. 60 kilometers north, at the Isfahan facility, nothing had changed. The guards at the pharmaceutical plant's surface entrance were monitoring their phones for news. The underground facility's own security relied on concealment, not defense. No dedicated short-range air defense.
No point defense system.
The assumption had always been that nobody could strike what nobody could find. The B-2s were 14 minutes out. 240 kilometers west of Isfahan, the second layer of Iran's response was already reacting. 3 batteries of Tor-M1 short-range air defense systems, Russian-built, deployed around the Natanz enrichment complex, began receiving repositioning orders. IRGC Air Defense Command had assessed the Tomahawk as a precursor strike, which it was, and concluded the primary target was Natanz, which it was not. The Tor-M1S began displacing northeast, pulling the short-range air defense umbrella away from the western approach corridors and concentrating it around a facility that was not under threat. Iran was reinforcing the wrong castle. This was not an accident. 5 hours earlier, a burst transmission from a U.S. cyber operations unit at Fort Meade had injected false intelligence into an Iranian military communications node that the NSA had been sitting inside for 7 months. The message, formatted to match authentic IRGC dispatch protocols, reported American submarine activity consistent with a Tomahawk strike package assembling south of Natanz. The IRGC's intelligence directorate assessed it as credible because it matched the pattern they were already watching. The Tomahawk from the Philippine Sea. A single ship, a single missile, pointed at a nuclear facility.
The logic was clean.
The logic was wrong. Iran was playing chess against an opponent who had read their playbook and then rewritten the last chapter. At 3:38 local time, the lead B-2 Spirit, callsign Phantom 1, reached its initial point 22 kilometers northwest of the Isfahan facility. The aircraft was invisible to every radar system currently operating in Iranian airspace, which was now a significantly smaller number than it had been 24 minutes earlier. The B-2's APQ-181 radar, operating in synthetic aperture ground mapping mode, painted the terrain below with a resolution fine enough to distinguish the pharmaceutical plant's loading docks from its parking structures. The weapons system officer confirmed the target coordinates against the pre-mission imagery. The aim point was not the building. It was a specific GPS coordinate 80 feet below the building, corresponding to the center of the Cascade Hall's ceiling as mapped by ground-penetrating radar data collected by an RQ-170 Sentinel drone 3 months earlier. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator is not a subtle weapon. It is 20 feet of hardened steel casing wrapped around 5,300 pounds of explosive, guided by coupled GPS and inertial navigation, designed to do one thing: go through whatever is between it and the target and then detonate. It enters the ground at terminal velocity, punches through layer after layer of earth and concrete using its own mass and speed, and detonates at a depth calculated to collapse whatever cavity exists at that level. Think of dropping a telephone pole made of tungsten-reinforced steel from 8 miles up and then detonating a small apartment building's worth of explosive at the bottom of the hole it makes. Phantom 1 released 2 GBU-57s in sequence, 4 seconds apart. The bombs fell for 38 seconds. They struck the surface of the pharmaceutical plant's main structure at 3:39 local time, 2 seconds apart. The first penetrator punched through the roof, through 3 floors of empty packaging equipment that had never packaged anything, through a 6-foot reinforced concrete transfer slab, through 40 feet of compacted earth and rock, and detonated against the ceiling of the Cascade Hall. The blast fractured the ceiling across a 30-meter radius. The second penetrator followed the first weapon's path through already shattered material, reached the Cascade Hall itself, and detonated inside it. 1,044 IR-6 centrifuges, spinning at 60,000 revolutions per minute, disintegrated. The uranium hexafluoride gas in the Cascade piping, pressurized and toxic, mixed with superheated air from the detonation and vented through every fracture the bombs had created. The surface of the pharmaceutical plant buckled, then partially collapsed into the cavity below. On seismographs at the University of Tehran, 340 kilometers away, the event registered as a magnitude 3.1. 18 seconds later, Phantom II released its weapons against the facility's underground power distribution center, 200 meters southeast of the Cascade Hall. Without power, even undamaged centrifuges would take 6 months to spin back up. With this damage, the timeline was closer to never. But Iran's air defense network was not finished. 50 kilometers south of the strike, a mobile S-300 PMU-2 battery that had been repositioned from Shiraz 48 hours earlier was scanning. Its crew had not received the reposition order that sent the Tor M1S chasing Phantoms toward Natanz, because the fiber optic link connecting their sector to the IRGC's central command had been severed by a strike 3 days ago. They were operating on pre-war standing orders. Defend Isfahan's southern approach.
Autonomous, disconnected, and competent.
The 92 N6 engagement radar swept the sky and found something it should not have been able to find. A B-2 Spirit at 42,000 feet. Not because the stealth had failed, but because Phantom III had opened its bomb bay doors 8 seconds earlier to release its weapons against a secondary target, and an open bomb bay on AB-2 multiplies the radar cross-section from the size of a bird to the size of a regional jet. For 8 seconds, the most expensive aircraft in human history advertised itself to anyone paying attention. The S-300 crew was paying attention. They transitioned from search to track in 22 seconds, fast even by Russian training standards. 248 N6 interceptor missiles cleared the rail at 3:41 local time. Each missile accelerating to Mach 6, 6 times the speed of sound, climbing toward a target that was already closing its bomb bay and becoming invisible again. The missiles had been given their initial target coordinates during launch. They would guide on those coordinates for the mid-course phase and then activate their own semi-active radar seekers for terminal guidance, relying on the ground radar to illuminate the target. The B-2 pilot, callsign Phantom III, received the missile launch warning from the aircraft's and APR-50 defensive management system.
The bomb bay was closed.
The radar cross-section had collapsed back to baseline, but 2 missiles were already in the air with a last known position that was accurate to within 100 meters. Stealth does not make you disappear.
It makes you hard to find.
Hard is not impossible when someone knows exactly where to start looking. Phantom III broke left and descended, putting the aircraft's lowest signature aspect toward the incoming missiles. The APR-50 began jamming the S-300's engagement radar, flooding it with false returns. At 42,000 feet and Mach 0.85, the B-2 is not a dogfighter.
It turns like a conference table.
The pilot had geometry and jamming and prayer, in approximately that order. 70 kilometers east, one of the F-15E Strike Eagles that had killed the Bavar 373 battery was already rolling in. The weapons officer had the S-300's emission on his scope from the moment it lit up. He had 1 AR-GMER remaining.
1 shot.
The missile came off the rail and covered the distance in 91 seconds. But the 48 N6 interceptors were 34 seconds from reaching Phantom III's last known position. The first 48 N6 reached the coordinates where Phantom III had been when the bomb bay was open. The aircraft was no longer there. The missile seeker activated and swept for a return. The jamming degraded the picture. The seeker found something, possibly the B-2's residual return, possibly a jam strobe, and corrected toward it. The proximity fuse detonated the warhead at a range the Air Force later classified. Phantom III reported no damage. The fragments had found air. The second 48 N6 was 6 seconds behind the first, correcting off updated radar data. The S-300's engagement radar was still transmitting, still trying to burn through the jamming to give the missile terminal guidance. The ARGMER struck the radar antenna at 3:42 local time.
The emission died.
The second 48N6, now without guidance updates, went autonomous.
Its seeker swept, found nothing.
The missile's fuel burned out at 70,000 feet and it fell into the desert east of Isfahan, a $1.5 million missile returning to Earth as expensive debris. The S-300 battery, worth $115 million, had gotten closer to killing a B-2 than any air defense system in history. The margin was measured in seconds and classification levels. Iran's crew had done everything right. They had hidden, waited, caught the one moment of vulnerability, and executed a textbook engagement. They lost because the aircraft they were shooting at costs $2.1 billion and carries countermeasures designed by people who spend careers imagining exactly this scenario.
Skill against budget. Budget won. It usually does.
By 3:48 local time, all 8 B-2s had released their ordnance. 128 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, each weighing 30,000 pounds, struck 6 separate underground facilities across the Isfahan complex within a 10-minute window. The combined ordnance weight exceeded 1.9 million kilograms.
The Cascade Hall was gone. The power distribution center was gone.
A tunnel network connecting the underground facilities to a dispersal site 4 kilometers east collapsed along 600 meters of its length. A centrifuge assembly workshop buried under a motor pool was now a crater. 2 decades of enrichment infrastructure, built in defiance of international sanctions, hidden beneath buildings designed to fool satellites, defended by air defense systems that cost billions and performed exactly as well as their operators could have hoped, was functionally destroyed in less time than it takes to order dinner. The B-2s turned west, climbing back to cruise altitude, bomb bays sealed, radar cross-sections shrinking back to the size of insects. They would land at Diego Garcia 9 hours later, where maintenance crews would discover that Phantom 3's left wing had taken a single fragment from the 48N6 proximity detonation, a 3-centimeter piece of Russian steel embedded in the radar-absorbent skin of a $2.1 billion aircraft. The repair would cost $4.2 million and take 3 weeks. The fragment itself would end up in a display case at Whiteman Air Force Base, the most expensive souvenir in Air Force history. In Tehran, the ARGC's air defense commander was still processing reports. The Bavar 373 battery that killed the Tomahawk was gone. The S-300 that nearly killed a B-2 was gone. The Tor M1 batteries he had repositioned to Natanz had defended a facility that was never attacked, and the facility he had left uncovered was now registering on seismographs. He had played every card correctly against the threat he could see. The threat he couldn't see had come from the opposite direction, at 42,000 feet, carrying ordnance heavy enough to rearrange the Earth. Iran's air defense network had been brilliant, disciplined, and aimed at a $2.1 million cruise missile, while $17 billion worth of stealth bombers rewrote the map behind them. The most expensive magic trick in military history, and the audience never saw the hands move. The enrichment program that had survived Stuxnet, survived sanctions, survived assassination, and survived diplomacy did not survive 10 minutes of B-2s. Somewhere in a Northrop Grumman boardroom, next quarter's earnings call just got a new opening slide. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on how the F-35 nearly got ambushed over Tehran. Bye for now. At 2:14 local time, an Israeli Air Force F-35 Ayadir dropped below 200 feet over the Persian Gulf, 40 miles south of Bandar Abbas, and released a payload that had never been used in combat before. The pilot didn't see the target. He didn't need to. The aircraft's mission computer had already confirmed coordinates transmitted from a source the pilot would never be briefed on, locked the weapon, and initiated release sequencing before the jet even crossed into Iranian airspace. The weapon fell for 11 seconds. Then its engine ignited and it disappeared from the pilot's heads-up display entirely. He pulled into a 7G climbing turn back toward tanker airspace.
His part was done.
The weapon's part was just beginning. 6 seconds later, 190 miles to the north, an operator at Iran's Karg Island oil terminal noticed something unusual on his monitoring screen. A pressure reading in the main crude distribution manifold had dropped by 4%. He noted it in his log. He assumed it was a sensor fault. Karg Island processes roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. On a normal day, 5 million barrels pass through its loading systems. This was not going to be a normal day. 1,200 miles to the west, at Nevatim Air Base in the Negev Desert, the operations center was running at full capacity. 47 personnel occupied stations in a room roughly the size of a basketball court. The air smelled like coffee and static electricity. 3 screens along the far wall displayed feeds from assets the Israeli Air Force doesn't publicly acknowledge having in theater. One of them showed a live infrared image of Karg Island from 62,000 feet. The operator watching it said nothing.
He just marked a timestamp.
2:14 and 31 seconds. 700 miles southeast, in the waters off Fujairah, 3 commercial supertankers sat at anchor waiting for loading schedules. Each one carried roughly 2 million barrels of capacity.
Each one was empty.
They had been empty for 11 days. The shipping companies that owned them had received quiet advisories from their insurance underwriters to delay Persian Gulf transits. No reason was given. No reason needed to be. When Lloyd's of London tells you to wait, you wait. And in Washington, D.C., where it was still 5:14 in the evening of the previous day, a statement had been drafted but not yet released. The statement concerned the Strait of Hormuz. It contained exactly one sentence that would rearrange global oil markets within hours of its publication. The sentence had been reviewed by the National Security Council, the Secretary of Defense, and the President himself. It read in part that the United States would consider any hostile interdiction of commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz as an act requiring immediate and proportional military response. The word proportional was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. It was about to do more. Back over the Persian Gulf, the weapon released from the F-35I had covered 140 miles in just under 4 minutes. It was a variant of the Rampage air-to-surface missile, a supersonic precision munition with a range of approximately 190 miles and a warhead designed not for blast damage but for structural penetration. Think of a telephone pole made of tungsten and high explosive moving at Mach 2.4. It doesn't need to destroy everything. It just needs to hit the right thing. At 2:18 local time, it hit the right thing. The target was not a military installation. It was not a nuclear facility. It was not a government building. It was a 36-inch high-pressure crude oil pipeline junction at the southern edge of Karg Island's Tank Farm No. 3. This junction connected the main export pipeline to 3 of the island's 6 single-point mooring buoys, the floating loading stations where tankers connect to take on crude. Without this junction, those 3 buoys were dead metal in the water. Half of Karg Island's export capacity disappeared in a moment measured in milliseconds. The explosion itself was modest. A flash. A pressure wave that broke windows in a control building 400 meters away. Then a fire that burned at 1,100 degrees for the next 14 hours. The operator who had noted the pressure drop 4 minutes earlier now had a very different problem on his screen. He wasn't looking at a sensor fault. He was looking at zero flow across the entire southern distribution network. He reached for the emergency communications panel. The line was dead. That wasn't an accident. 70 seconds before the Rampage missile reached its target, an Israeli cyber operation that had been dormant inside Karg Island's communications infrastructure for an estimated 19 months activated a prepositioned payload. It didn't destroy the communication system. That would have been obvious and quickly repaired. Instead, it introduced a 5,000 millisecond delay on all outgoing signals from the island's primary and secondary communications nodes. 5 seconds. That doesn't sound like much. In the next 90 minutes, it would be enough. 320 miles to the northwest, a second strike was arriving. This one came from the Mediterranean. 2 Israeli F-15I RAM aircraft operating from a position over northern Syria had launched 4 Delilah cruise missiles 12 minutes earlier. The Delilah is slower than the Rampage, subsonic, about 600 miles per hour. But it has a capability the Rampage doesn't. It can loiter. It can circle a target area for up to 30 minutes, waiting for updated targeting data before committing to its final attack run. These 4 Delilahs were not circling. They were inbound and locked. Their target was the Abadan oil refinery complex in southwestern Iran, one of the oldest and most important refineries in the country. Abadan processes 400,000 barrels of crude per day. It sits on the Shat al-Arab waterway, 11 miles from the Iraqi border. The Delilahs were coming in from the west, below 100 feet, following the river. Iranian air defense coverage in Khuzestan province is dense. On paper, the province hosts 3 battalions of S-300 PMU-2 long-range surface-to-air missile systems, 2 batteries of Bavar 373 indigenous air defense systems, and multiple short-range point defense installations. On any other night, detecting 4 subsonic cruise missiles crossing the border at low altitude would have been difficult but possible, given the radar coverage overlaps designed into the network. On this night, it was impossible. Because at 2:11 local time, 3 minutes before the first Rampage hit Karg Island, every early warning radar in a 200-mile radius of Abadan experienced what would later be described as a catastrophic synchronization failure. This was the second cyber operation. and it was significantly more aggressive than the first. Rather than introducing delays, this payload attacked the timing protocols that allow multiple radar installations to coordinate their coverage and hand off tracking data between stations. Without synchronized timing, each radar station still functioned individually. Each one could still detect objects in its own sector. But none of them could talk to each other. And none of them could pass targeting data to the missile batteries that depended on that information to engage threats. Each radar operator saw pieces of the picture. None of them saw all of it. The 4 Delilahs threaded through the gaps like water through a cracked dam. At 2:22 local time, the first Delilah struck the main atmospheric distillation column at Abadan's Unit 2 processing facility. The second hit the adjacent crude desalting plant. The third struck a 200,000-barrel floating roof storage tank. The fourth missed its intended target by 40 meters and detonated on a maintenance road.
The first 3 were enough.
Within 6 minutes, fires were burning across an area the size of 4 football fields. Secondary explosions in the desalting plant sent burning hydrocarbons into the drainage system that fed into the Shat al-Arab waterway. A black cloud visible from Basra, Iraq, 30 miles away, began to climb. 600 miles to the east, Iran's response was already in motion. But it was the wrong response. At 2:16, 2 minutes after the Karg Island strike, Iran's Supreme National Security Council received initial reports of an explosion on the island. The information was fragmentary because of the communications delay. But the SNSC had anticipated an Israeli strike against its nuclear program for months. Every contingency plan, every prepositioned response, every retaliatory option was built around that assumption. The assumption was that any Israeli attack would target Natanz, Isfahan, or Fordow. The nuclear triad. Every wargame they had run, every scenario they had planned for, started with those 3 locations. At 2:19, a duty officer in Tehran ordered a general air defense alert across all nuclear-associated facilities. S-300 batteries at Natanz powered to full readiness. Bavar 373 units at Isfahan began sweep scanning. Fighter squadrons at Mehrabad and Tabriz were ordered to immediate alert status. Within 12 minutes, Iran had its most sophisticated air defense umbrella active and scanning. It was covering the wrong targets. No Israeli aircraft were within 400 miles of any nuclear facility.
That was the point.
1,200 miles from Tehran, aboard the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower operating in the Gulf of Oman, the Carrier Strike Group's intelligence center was watching everything. They weren't participating. Not yet. Their role, for now, was to observe and to maintain a posture that the Pentagon described internally as conspicuous readiness. The Eisenhower had 2 squadrons of F divided by a -18E divided by F Super Hornets, a squadron of EA-18G Growlers electronic warfare aircraft, and an air wing that had been at elevated readiness for 9 days. Conspicuous readiness meant that Iranian intelligence could see the carrier group, could see its aircraft on the flight deck, could detect the electronic emissions of a strike group preparing for operations. It was meant to be visible. It was meant to create doubt. If Iran retaliated against Israel, would the Americans join? The answer was supposed to be unclear. Unclear is more powerful than certain. What Iran's intelligence services could not see was what was 200 miles behind the Eisenhower. 3 Ohio-class guided missile submarines. Each one carrying 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles. That's 462 cruise missiles in a space roughly the size of a small parking lot, sitting quietly at 400 feet below the surface of the Arabian Sea. They had been in position for 6 days. They had received no launch orders. They had received one message, repeated daily for the last 4 days. 4 words: maintain current posture, stand by. Back in Washington, the statement about the Strait of Hormuz was released at 5:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Within 11 minutes, Brent crude futures spiked $14 per barrel. Within 30 minutes, the spike hit $22. Trading algorithms that had been watching for keywords including Hormuz, military response, and proportional triggered automated buying across every major commodity exchange simultaneously. By the time human traders at the London IC exchange started their morning 6 hours later, oil was at $127 per barrel and climbing. 24 hours earlier it had been at $89.
This was story 1.
Israeli strikes on Iranian oil infrastructure. American threats regarding the strait. A regional crisis with global energy implications. Every news network on the planet was running this story by 3 a.m. local time. Satellites were being repositioned. Analysts were being woken up. Retired generals were sitting in studio chairs explaining what they thought would happen next. What they didn't know was that the oil infrastructure was the distraction. The real operation had started 11 hours earlier, at 3 p.m. local time on the previous afternoon, and it had nothing to do with missiles, aircraft, or pipelines. At 3:02 p.m. the previous day, an Iranian-flagged container ship named the Shari Cord, a 40,000-ton vessel operating a regular route between Bandar Abbas and the port of Latakia in Syria, suffered what its crew reported as a catastrophic engine room failure approximately 15 miles inside the Strait of Hormuz.
The vessel lost propulsion. It began to drift.
The crew deployed an emergency anchor in one of the most congested shipping channels on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest point is 21 miles wide. The shipping lanes used by tanker traffic are 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. A 40,000-ton ship sitting dead in the water in one of those lanes is the maritime equivalent of a jackknifed tractor trailer on a two-lane highway. Traffic began to stack up almost immediately. By 4 p.m., 6 tankers were holding positions south of the disabled vessel, waiting for tugs. By 6 p.m., the number was 14. By midnight, 23 commercial vessels of various types were either holding position, diverting around the obstruction, or anchored in designated waiting areas. Iranian port authorities at Bandar Abbas offered tug assistance. The tugs arrived at 7:30 p.m.
They connected lines.
They attempted to move the Shari Cord.
The ship didn't budge.
The tugs reported that the vessel's anchor chain appeared to be fouled on something on the seabed. The anchor couldn't be retrieved.
The ship couldn't be towed.
Nobody in any Western intelligence service flagged this as unusual. Container ships break down. Anchors get fouled.
It happens.
The Strait of Hormuz experiences an average of 3 significant shipping disruptions per month.
This was routine. Annoying but routine. It was not routine.
The Shari Cord's engine room failure had been manufactured. The anchor was not fouled on the seabed. It was functioning exactly as intended. The ship's purpose was not to transit to Latakia. Its purpose was to sit precisely where it was sitting for precisely as long as it was sitting there. Because directly beneath the Shari Cord, on the floor of the strait at a depth of 80 meters, sat something that had been placed there 14 weeks earlier by an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy midget submarine.
It was a mine.
But not a conventional naval mine. It was a rising mine, a weapon that sits on the seabed and upon activation, releases a torpedo that ascends to intercept a target passing overhead. This particular variant was the EM-52, a Chinese-designed system that Iran had been suspected of possessing since 2015 but had never confirmed. The EM-52 can engage targets in water up to 200 meters deep. Its torpedo component has a range of approximately 10 miles. There wasn't just one. There were 6. Spaced at 1,500-meter intervals along the shipping lanes. The Shari Cord was sitting on top of one of them, not because the ship was part of the mine deployment, but because the ship's position was intended to force tanker traffic into a predictable diversion pattern. When ships can't use the normal channel, they use the alternate channel. The alternate channel ran directly over 4 of the other 5 mines. It was a kill box, and 23 ships were slowly being herded into it. The American statement about the strait was not a coincidence. It was based on intelligence. 96 hours earlier, a signals intelligence platform operating from a facility in Bahrain had intercepted a burst transmission from a known IRGC Navy command node to 3 fast attack craft bases along the Iranian coast. The transmission was encrypted, but its structure matched a pattern that NSA analysts had catalogued 4 years earlier during a previous escalation. The pattern was associated with mine warfare activation.
Not deployment. Activation.
The mines were already in the water. What the transmission ordered was the arming sequence. A second intercept, from a different source, provided partial geographic coordinates. Those coordinates were in the Strait of Hormuz. They were verified within 12 hours by an underwater drone launched from a Virginia-class submarine operating in the Gulf of Oman. The drone, an autonomous system called Razorback, covered 45 miles of seabed and returned with sonar imagery confirming 6 bottom-mounted objects consistent with EM-52 mine profiles. That intelligence went from Bahrain to CENTCOM in Tampa to the Pentagon to the White House in less than 4 hours. The presidential statement about the strait was drafted the same day. The timing of its release, simultaneous with the Israeli strikes, was not a coincidence either.
It was coordinated. Not publicly. Not formally.
Through a channel that doesn't appear in any organizational chart. So there were now 2 crises unfolding simultaneously, and most of the world only knew about one of them. The visible crisis was the Israeli strikes on Iranian oil infrastructure.
Karg Island burning. Abadan burning. Oil prices climbing.
That crisis was loud, photogenic, and impossible to ignore. The invisible crisis was 6 mines in the Strait of Hormuz, a dead container ship sitting on top of one of them, and 23 vessels slowly repositioning into a pattern that would give Iran the ability to shut down 21% of the world's daily oil supply in under 3 minutes. In Tehran, the Supreme National Security Council was in emergency session. The room was divided. The strikes on Karg Island and Abadan were an act of war. There was no ambiguity about that. The damage to Karg alone would reduce Iran's oil export capacity by an estimated 40% for a minimum of 6 months. Abadan would take longer. The economic impact was staggering. Iran's oil revenue for the current fiscal year was projected at approximately $50 billion. 40% of export capacity gone meant roughly $20 billion in lost revenue. Annual. For at least a year. The math was not complicated. The IRGC commander present in the session argued for immediate activation of the Strait contingency. The mines were armed. The fast attack craft were loaded with anti-ship missiles. 62 missile boats, each carrying 2 to 4 C-802 anti-ship cruise missiles, were dispersed along the Iranian coastline between Bandar Abbas and Jask. The total missile count exceeded 200. Against commercial shipping, those numbers were overwhelming. Tankers don't have countermeasures. They don't maneuver. They're 1,000-foot steel boxes moving at 15 knots. Even a 20% hit rate would mean 40 missiles finding targets. The strait would be closed within hours. Oil would hit $200 per barrel. Maybe $250. The economic damage to the West would dwarf what Israel had just done to Iran. The foreign minister argued the opposite. The American statement had changed the calculus. Closing the strait would not trigger an American diplomatic protest. It would trigger a military response. And unlike previous administrations that had drawn red lines and then negotiated around them, this White House had positioned assets that made the threat credible. The Eisenhower strike group was visible. The statement was public. The word proportional gave the Americans legal and political cover to do almost anything. What the foreign minister didn't know, and what the IRGC commander didn't know, was what was 200 miles behind the Eisenhower. Those 3 Ohio-class submarines. 462 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Proportional is an interesting word when you have 462 cruise missiles available. The debate in Tehran lasted 47 minutes. The decision was to activate Phase 1 of the Strait contingency but not Phase 2. Phase 1 meant the fast attack craft would deploy from their bases and take up pre-assigned positions along the coast, visible to American surveillance, creating a threat posture. The mines would remain armed but not triggered. Phase 2, the actual mining and missile attacks on shipping, would be held in reserve as a deterrent. The logic was that the threat of closing the strait was almost as powerful as actually closing it, and significantly less likely to result in an American attack. It was a reasonable calculation. It had one flaw. The flaw was that Israel already knew about Phase 1. They knew because the communications network that carried the SNSC's orders to IRGC Navy Command was compromised. Not the encryption. The metadata. Israeli signals intelligence didn't know what the order said, but they knew when they were sent, from where, to whom, and the response patterns they generated. When 62 missile boats began leaving their berths within 20 minutes of the SNSC session ending, the pattern matched what Israeli intelligence had predicted for a strait closure posture. At 3:40 local time, roughly 90 minutes after the first strike on Karg Island, the Israeli operation entered its second phase. This phase had no missiles, no aircraft, and no explosions. It was conducted entirely in the electromagnetic spectrum. 4 Israeli Gulfstream G550 aircraft modified for signals intelligence and electronic warfare, known as the Nakhon Shavat and Nakhon Item, had been orbiting in a racetrack pattern over the Red Sea at 41,000 feet since midnight. They had been silent until now. At 3:40, all 4 aircraft activated their electronic warfare suites simultaneously. The effect was immediate. Iranian naval communications along the entire southern coastline degraded by approximately 70%. The 62 fast attack craft that had just deployed from their bases suddenly couldn't talk to their command authority with any reliability. Some lost communications entirely. Others received garbled fragments. The boats were designed to operate independently if necessary, but their commanders had trained for a coordinated missile saturation attack. Without coordination, each boat was a single unit with 2 to 4 missiles. Individually, they were annoying. Collectively, they were devastating. Israel had just turned collectively into individually. At the same time, 400 miles to the east, something happened that nobody in Tehran or Jerusalem had planned for. The Shari cord, the container ship sitting dead in the Strait of Hormuz, moved. Not because the tugs pulled it free. Because its anchor chain broke. Or more precisely, because the anchor chain was cut. a U.S. Navy explosive ordnance disposal team operating from a rigid-hull inflatable boat that had been staged from the USS Nitsa, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operating nearby, had placed a small shaped charge on the anchor chain at a depth of 30 meters. The charge detonated at 3:38 local time.
The chain parted.
The tugs, which were still connected, immediately began towing the now-free vessel south, out of the shipping lane. Within 20 minutes, the Shari cord was clear. Traffic could resume through the normal channel. The normal channel that did not run over the mines. The Iranians recognized what had happened almost immediately. The anchor chain didn't break on its own. The timing, 2 minutes before the Israeli electronic warfare activation, was not a coincidence. Someone had coordinated this. The Shari cord gambit was burned. But the mines were still in the water. And the mines were still armed. In Tampa, at CENTCOM headquarters, the mine problem was now the priority. 6 EM, 52 rising mines in the world's most important shipping choke point. Each one capable of killing a supertanker. The standard approach to mine clearance is methodical. You send mine countermeasure vessels, MH-53EC Dragon helicopters towing minesweeping gear, unmanned underwater vehicles to locate and neutralize each mine individually.
It takes days. Sometimes weeks.
The strait couldn't be closed for weeks. Every day of closure cost the global economy roughly $2.5 billion. The non-standard approach was faster.
And riskier.
At 4:15 local time, AP-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft operating from Naval Support Activity Bahrain arrived over the strait at 25,000 feet. It was carrying sonobuoys, expendable underwater sensors that could be dropped from the aircraft to create an acoustic picture of the seabed. Over the next 40 minutes, the Poseidon dropped 36 sonobuoys in a grid pattern covering the area identified by the Razorback drone's earlier survey. The sonobuoy data was relayed in real time to the Nitsa, which had the most advanced mine warfare software package in the strike group. Simultaneously, 2 MH-60S Seahawk helicopters launched from the Eisenhower carrying airborne mine neutralization systems, essentially remote-controlled underwater vehicles with explosive charges that could be guided to a mine and detonated. Each helicopter carried 2 neutralization vehicles.
4 vehicles. 6 mines.
The math wasn't perfect. 50 miles to the south, a second underwater drone was launched from the Virginia-class submarine. This one wasn't mapping. It was carrying 4 lightweight charges specifically designed for bottom mine neutralization. The drone's transit time to the minefield was estimated at 90 minutes.
Too long for the first pass.
The helicopters would have to do what they could with 4 vehicles and hope the submarine's drone arrived in time for the remaining mines. At 4:55 local time, the first airborne mine neutralization vehicle reached its target. The mine was sitting in 75 meters of water, partially buried in silt. The neutralization vehicle positioned itself within 2 meters of the mine and detonated. The explosion was felt on the surface as a dull thump. Sonobuoy data confirmed the mine was destroyed.
1 down, 5 to go.
The second vehicle reached its target at 5:03. Successful detonation.
2 down.
The third vehicle experienced a guidance malfunction at 5:10 and drifted off course. The operator on the Seahawk attempted to regain control. The vehicle's battery died at 5:14. It sank to the seabed, useless. 3 vehicles expended.
2 mines destroyed. 1 failed.
The fourth and final vehicle was deployed at 5:18 toward the third mine. Successful detonation at 5:24. 3 mines neutralized. 3 remaining. The helicopters had nothing left. The submarine drone was still 40 minutes out.
40 minutes.
In those 40 minutes, 3 armed mines sat in the shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz. 3 mines that could each destroy a supertanker. 3 mines that the Iranian IRGC Navy still had the ability to trigger remotely. And in Tehran, the argument about Phase 2 was starting again. The IRGC commander now had new information. The Americans had moved the Shari cord. The Americans were actively clearing the mines. The Iranian contingency was being dismantled in real time. If Phase 2 was going to happen, it needed to happen now, before the remaining mines were neutralized. The window was closing. 62 missile boats were in position, though many had degraded communications. The 3 remaining mines were armed and could be command detonated. The foreign minister's counter-argument was simpler now. The Americans were clearing the mines. That meant the Americans knew about the mines. That meant the American threat about the strait was not hypothetical. It was operational. If Iran triggered those mines or launched anti-ship missiles at commercial shipping, the response would not be a statement. It would be 462 Tomahawk cruise missiles. And those would not be aimed at oil infrastructure. They would be aimed at every IRGC Navy base, every missile storage facility, every command center, and every fast attack craft that could be located. The IRGC Navy would cease to exist as a functional force in approximately 90 minutes. There was also the question of China. China buys roughly 27% of Iran's oil exports. China had not been consulted about the Strait contingency. China would not appreciate having its energy supply interrupted by an Iranian decision made in the heat of a crisis. Beijing's ambassador had already called twice. He had not been put through to anyone with decision-making authority. That was a mistake that would have consequences regardless of what happened in the next hour. At 5:45 local time, with dawn beginning to lighten the eastern horizon over the Gulf of Oman, the SNSC reached its second decision. Phase 2 would not be activated. The remaining mines would be left in place as a card to be played later, but not triggered. The fast attack craft were ordered to return to port. The strait would remain open. Iran would pursue its response through other channels: diplomatic, economic, asymmetric. The IRGC commander left the session without speaking to anyone. His deputy, waiting in an anteroom, asked him what had been decided. He said one sentence. It wasn't recorded, but it was reported later by 3 separate sources with minor variations. The version most commonly cited translates roughly to, "We just paid $50 billion to learn that our Navy is a suggestion." He wasn't entirely wrong. The 62 missile boats were returning to port. The electronic warfare jamming from the Israeli Gulfstream aircraft had lifted once the boats began withdrawing, which confirmed for the IRGC that the jamming had been targeted and deliberate, not some broad-spectrum interference. The Israelis had known exactly which frequencies to hit. That meant they had been listening for a very long time. At 6:04 local time, the submarine-launched underwater drone reached the 4th mine. Successful neutralization. At 6:22, the 5th. At 6:41, the 6th and final mine was destroyed. The Strait of Hormuz was clear. The entire mine neutralization operation had taken 1 hour and 46 minutes from first vehicle deployment to last detonation. The standard timeline for clearing a minefield of that size in a contested environment was 5 to 8 days. CENTCOM's after-action report would later describe the operation as compressed but acceptable. An unofficial assessment from the EOD team that cut the Shari Cord's anchor chain used different language. They called it stupid lucky. Back in the daylight, the visible damage was becoming clear. Satellite imagery of Karg Island showed a fire burning across the southern tank farm with a smoke plume extending 40 miles downwind. The pipeline junction was destroyed. 3 of 6 loading buoys were inoperable. Iranian emergency crews were on scene but struggling to contain the fire because the water supply system for the firefighting infrastructure drew from a pumping station that had been damaged by debris from the initial strike. A $3.2 million missile had knocked out a pipeline junction, 3 loading buoys, a control building, and a firefighting pumping station. Total estimated repair cost, $1.4 billion. Estimated repair time, 8 to 14 months. Abadan was worse. The atmospheric distillation column is the heart of any refinery. Without it, crude oil is just crude oil. It can't be processed into gasoline, diesel, kerosene, or any other usable product. Abadan's Unit 2 distillation column was a total loss. The desalting plant was a total loss. The storage tank would burn for another 9 days before it consumed all available fuel. Repair estimates for Abadan ranged from $2.1 billion to $3.6 billion depending on which engineering assessment you trusted. Timeline, 18 months to 3 years. 4 missiles had hit Abadan. 3 of them found their targets. Total missile cost, approximately $4.8 million. The damage they inflicted would cost at least $2 billion to repair and remove billions more in refining capacity from the market for years. The cost ratio was not lost on analysts. $1 million of Israeli munitions had purchased roughly $400 million of Iranian economic damage. That ratio would appear in every defense procurement brief for the next decade. On global markets, the picture was equally dramatic. By 8 a.m. London time, Brent crude had reached $134 per barrel. By noon, it touched $141 before settling back to $136 on reports that the strait remained open. The strait remaining open was the only thing preventing a complete market panic. If those 6 mines had been triggered, if even one supertanker had been hit, the model showed oil reaching $200 within 48 hours and $250 within a week. The global economic impact of a sustained strait closure was estimated at $4 trillion annualized. The mines that prevented that scenario had cost approximately $12 million to manufacture and deploy. The neutralization vehicles, submarine drones, sonobuoys, and operational costs to clear them exceeded $200 million. A $12 million investment had required a $200 million response. That ratio also appeared in the procurement briefs. In Jerusalem, the Israeli cabinet met in an emergency session that lasted 3 hours. The strikes were described as a limited defensive operation targeting Iran's ability to fund hostile activities against Israel. The phrase economic heart was not used by any Israeli official. It didn't need to be. Every headline in the world was already using it. The cabinet authorized continued intelligence operations but no additional strikes. The message had been delivered. It was a very expensive message, delivered very precisely, to a very specific set of targets chosen not for their military significance but for their economic irreplaceability. Israel had not touched a single military base, a single air defense site, a single government building. It had hit the money. Everything else flows from money. In Washington, the president held a brief press availability at 8 a.m. Eastern. He confirmed that U.S. forces had conducted freedom of navigation operations in the Strait of Hormuz. He did not mention mines. He did not mention the Shari Cord. He did not mention underwater drones or explosive ordnance disposal teams cutting anchor chains in the dark. He said that the strait was open, that it would remain open, and that any entity attempting to close it would face consequences. When asked about the Israeli strikes, he said that Israel had the right to defend itself and that the United States had not participated in offensive operations. Both statements were technically accurate. The mine clearance was classified as a defensive operation. The electronic warfare aircraft were Israeli, not American. The distinction between participating and coordinating was apparently a matter of interpretation. Beijing's response came at 11 a.m. Beijing time, roughly 12 hours after the first strike. It was unusually blunt by Chinese diplomatic standards. The foreign ministry spokesman described the strikes as reckless and destabilizing and called for all parties to exercise restraint. The interesting word was not reckless. It was all parties. China was not singling out Israel. It was warning Iran as well. Don't close the strait. We need that oil more than you need revenge. The ambassador in Tehran was finally put through to the foreign minister. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Its contents were not disclosed, but Iran's state media coverage of the crisis shifted notably afterward. The language about retaliation became less specific. The timelines became vaguer. Some things translate the same in every language. One of them is don't do anything stupid. 72 hours after the strikes, a preliminary damage assessment compiled by commercial satellite analytics firms estimated the total economic impact as follows. Direct infrastructure damage to Karg Island and Abadan, $3.50 to $5 billion. Lost oil revenue for Iran over the following 12 months, $18 to $24 billion. Increased global oil costs attributable to the supply disruption, approximately $400 billion annualized, distributed across every oil-importing economy on the planet. Cost of the Israeli munitions used in the strikes, approximately $17 million. Cost of the American mine clearance operation, approximately $200 million. Cost of the mines themselves, approximately $12 million. The most expensive single item destroyed in the entire operation was a crude oil storage tank at Abadan that had been built in 1963. Its replacement cost was estimated at $180 million. The missile that destroyed it cost $1.2 million. The missile that missed its target and hit a maintenance road cost the same $1.2 million. It destroyed approximately $40,000 worth of asphalt. 6 weeks later, the Shari Cord was quietly towed to a shipyard in Bandar Abbas. An inspection of its engine room found nothing wrong with its engines. Both main propulsion diesel engines were fully functional. The engine room failure had been simulated by the crew on orders from IRGC Navy Command. The crew had not been told why. They had been told to fake a breakdown at specific coordinates and deploy their anchor. They did what they were told. They spent 11 hours sitting on top of a weapon that could have killed every person on their ship if something had gone wrong. They were not told about the mine. The IRGC Navy did not consider this relevant to their assignment. The captain of the Shari Cord resigned from the Iranian merchant marine within a month. He did not give a public reason. People who knew him said he had developed a persistent fear of deep water. Nobody else resigned. The oil kept burning. The prices kept climbing. And in shipping offices from Singapore to Rotterdam to Houston, insurance underwriters quietly added a new surcharge to every policy covering Persian Gulf transits. The surcharge was 17%. Nobody argued about it. When the math is that clear, nobody needs to. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on how Iran's mine warfare strategy nearly shut down the Persian Gulf in 1988. Bye for now. The aircraft carrier was already under threat before anyone aboard knew it. Somewhere along the Yemeni coastline, buried in a network of wadis and mobile platforms that had been rehearsing this moment for weeks, a launch sequence was entering its final authorization. Not a test, not a drill, not another propaganda video with painted warheads and chanting crowds. This was a coordinated strike package aimed at the largest warship in the United States' Fifth Fleet operating area, and the people behind it believed they had solved the one problem that had defeated every previous attempt. They believed they had found a way to overwhelm the screen. USS Abraham Lincoln was 17 hours into a scheduled transit of the Strait of Hormuz when the morning of the attack began like every other morning in that part of the world. Hot, hazy, and dense with traffic. The strait is not a wide ocean passage. It is a compressed corridor where supertankers, container ships, fishing dhows, naval escorts, and surveillance aircraft all share roughly the same 40 miles of navigable water. Radar returns in Hormuz do not come in clean. They come in thick, layered, contradictory, full of commercial clutter and environmental noise that turns every scope into a puzzle. For the crews aboard Lincoln and her escorts, operating in Hormuz meant operating in a place where the background was loud enough to hide almost anything. The strike group was arranged in standard transit formation, destroyers and a cruiser positioned outboard, holding sectors, sweeping with their spy radar arrays while Lincoln herself moved through the center of the corridor. The carrier's own sensors were active, but primarily feeding the shared tactical picture rather than driving independent engagement. That was the escort's job during transit. Protect the high-value unit. Keep the geometry clean. Buy time if something appeared. Nothing appeared at first. What happened instead was subtler and, in retrospect, more dangerous. At approximately 5:38 local time, an electronic warfare operator aboard one of the screening destroyers flagged an anomaly in the emissions environment. It was not a missile. It was not a radar lock. It was a brief, structured pulse from a bearing that did not correspond to any known commercial or military emitter in the area. The pulse lasted less than 2 seconds. It repeated once, then vanished. The operator logged it, tagged it for review, and continued sorting through the morning's electronic clutter. On any other day, in any other body of water, that notation might have sat in a queue for hours. But this was Hormuz, and the operator had been briefed on something specific before the transit began. Intelligence assessments in the days prior had flagged an increase in Houthi-affiliated communications activity along the western Yemeni coast and, more unusually, along relay nodes that extended toward the southern Iranian littoral. The pattern did not point to a specific attack. It pointed to preparation, coordination signals, timing references, the kind of electronic behavior that precedes an operation without confirming one. So the operator did not wait for a second look. He pushed the flag up immediately. Possible coordination emission, non-commercial, bearing 274. Duration brief. No track associated. That report reached Lincoln's Combat Information Center 40 seconds later. It arrived alongside a dozen other data points, most of them routine, but it was the one that made the senior watch officer pause. He pulled up the intelligence summary from the pre-transit brief. He compared the bearing. He looked at the time. Then he made a quiet decision that would matter enormously in the minutes ahead. He told the air defense coordinator to tighten the western sector and lower the classification threshold for any new contacts on that bearing. That meant the system would treat ambiguous returns with more suspicion than usual. It meant the algorithms that separated threat from noise would lean toward caution. It meant that if something small and fast appeared from the west, the strike group would see it a few seconds earlier than it otherwise would have. A few seconds. In Hormuz, that is the difference between interception and impact. At 5:41, 3 contacts appeared simultaneously. They did not emerge gradually from the clutter the way a slow-moving surface vessel might. They materialized in a cluster, low, fast, and tight, riding just above the wave tops at a speed that immediately eliminated any possibility they were commercial aircraft or fishing boats. The returns were small, deliberately small. The kind of radar cross-section you get from something designed to stay invisible until the last possible moment. The track supervisor in CIC called it first. Multiple fast movers bearing 278. Low altitude, speed accelerating. Range is compressing on the western screen. Nobody responded with words. The room responded with motion. Chairs turned. Headsets pressed tighter against ears. Fingers moved to keys that had been resting idle. The shared tactical display updated and every console in CIC now showed the same ugly geometry. 3 inbound tracks converging on the formation from the west, with a carrier sitting at the center of their projected intercept cone. On Lincoln's bridge, the report came through clean. The captain did not ask for elaboration. He asked one question: are they solving on us or crossing? The answer took 4 seconds to formulate because the tracks were still building. Then CIC responded. Lead contacts show inbound bias. Not crossing. Solving toward the formation center. The captain gave his first order. Set condition 1 for air defense throughout the strike group. All stations report readiness. That order did not create panic. It created precision. Throughout Lincoln and across every escort in the formation, the transition from transit posture to full defensive readiness unfolded with the mechanical certainty of something practiced 1,000 times. Weapons systems that had been in standby warmed to full capability. Radar modes shifted from broad surveillance to narrow, high-resolution tracking. Engagement envelopes were calculated and shared across the data links that bound the strike group into a single fighting organism. On the flight deck, the change was visible within seconds. Yellow-shirt aircraft handlers began clearing exposed lanes. A tow tractor pulling an F divided by a -18E toward a maintenance spot halted, reversed, and repositioned the jet against the island where it would be less vulnerable to blast or fragmentation. Ordnance crews who had been performing routine checks on weapon stations dropped their clipboards and assumed positions that said one thing clearly: we are no longer maintaining, we are preparing. The 3 inbound contacts continued to close. Their profiles now showed characteristics consistent with anti-ship cruise missiles flying a sea-skimming approach. Low enough to hide in surface clutter, fast enough to compress reaction time, spread just wide enough to force multiple engagement solutions rather than allowing a single interceptor to deal with a cluster. This was not random harassment. This was geometry designed to stress the screen. At 5:42, the first escort engaged. A destroyer positioned on the western flank of the formation had the cleanest look at the lead contact. Its fire control radar locked the track, confirmed the solution, and the ship's combat system generated the launch command. An SM-2 left its vertical launch cell in a column of white exhaust and smoke, climbing briefly before pitching over toward the inbound target. The intercept geometry was tight. Sea-skimming targets give defenders almost no altitude margin, which means the interceptor has to find its prey in the worst possible radar environment, down in the wave clutter where returns are dirty and discrimination is hard. The missile found its target anyway. On Lincoln's displays, the lead inbound track fragmented into a scatter of false returns, then disappeared. The destroyer confirmed. Splash 1. Track destroyed. But the kill did something unexpected. The debris field from the intercept, combined with the radar disruption of the explosion itself, briefly masked the area behind the lead contact. For approximately 3 seconds, the strike group lost clean visibility on the remaining 2 inbounds. When the picture reconstituted, both surviving tracks had shifted. One had jinked south, the other had dropped even lower, so low that the escort's radar was now struggling to hold it consistently above the sea return. They had used the first missile as a screen. Whether by design or by accident, the destruction of the lead contact had bought the trailing weapons a precious window of ambiguity. The tactical action officer recognized it immediately. They staggered the raid on purpose. The first one was meant to die early. That realization changed the calculation. If the enemy had planned for the loss of the lead missile, then the approach was more sophisticated than a simple volley. It suggested coordination, timing, and an understanding of how the strike group's defenses would respond. It suggested someone had studied the American playbook. At 5:43, both surviving contacts were now inside the outer engagement envelope and closing fast. The southern track was assigned to a cruiser that had better angle. The other remained with the original destroyer. Both ships fired within seconds of each other. 2 more interceptors left their cells and raced toward the incoming threats. The southern intercept was clean. The cruiser's missile met the inbound at sufficient range to keep debris well clear of the formation. A bright flash low on the horizon, a column of spray, and the track disappeared from every screen in the group. The second intercept was not clean. The destroyer's missile appeared to guide correctly but detonated at the edge of its effective range. The inbound target broke apart, but not completely. Fragments continued along the original flight path, some of them still carrying enough energy to register as returns on the inner defense systems. Lincoln's close-in weapon system tracked the debris automatically, evaluated it, and held fire. The fragments were ballistic now, no longer guided, no longer a threat to the carrier specifically. They splashed into the Gulf several hundred meters off the port beam of an escort. The first wave was over. 3 missiles launched, 3 missiles destroyed. No hits on any ship in the formation. The screen had held. But in CIC, nobody relaxed. The electronic warfare picture was telling a different story than the one the radar had just resolved. During the engagement, EW operators had continued monitoring the emissions environment. What they found was troubling. The coordination pulse that had been flagged before the attack had reappeared twice during the raid, each time on a slightly different frequency and bearing. More critically, a second emitter had become active during the final seconds of the engagement. This one was farther south, on a bearing that did not align with the first wave's approach axis. Someone was still transmitting. Someone was still coordinating. The fight was not finished. The senior EW officer delivered the assessment to the TAO with the kind of flat certainty that comes from seeing a pattern lock into place. The first wave was the forcing play. They wanted us to commit the screen westward. There is a second axis. Southern bearings are active and correlating with pre-attack intelligence. The TAO did not hesitate. He passed the warning to the entire strike group on the command net. All stations be advised. Second attack axis probable from the south-southeast.
Adjust sectors. Maintain full defensive posture. The formation responded.
Escorts that had been leaning west now redistributed their attention. A destroyer on the southern flank shifted its primary radar mode and began sweeping the new threat bearing with concentrated energy. The cruiser that had just killed the southern missile from the first wave was already oriented correctly and tightened its track management. At 5:48, the second wave appeared.
Not from the west.
From the south-southeast, exactly where the emissions had predicted. 2 contacts initially, then a third, then a fourth that flickered in and out of detectability with the kind of signature that suggested either a very small weapon or a decoy designed to absorb defensive attention. The geometry was immediately worse than the first wave. The southern approach gave the inbounds a shorter flight path to the carrier. It also forced the strike group to defend on 2 axes simultaneously, because nobody could yet confirm that the western threat was fully spent. For all anyone knew, a third salvo could still come from the original direction. Lincoln's captain made a decision that reflected the narrowness of the strait and the complexity of the threat.
He ordered a course change, not a dramatic turn, not a sprint.
A controlled adjustment that would alter the carrier's position relative to the incoming tracks while keeping the formation coherent and the escorts in position to defend.
5 degrees to starboard.
Enough to shift the firing solution that any inbound seeker was trying to solve. Enough to buy another fraction of a second. The southern screen engaged almost immediately. The first interceptor left a destroyer cells at 5:49 and climbed into the haze. A second followed from the cruiser. The outer contacts were the priority. Kill them far out, create space, prevent the raid from collapsing onto the carrier. The first intercept hit. A hard kill at range. The kind that produces a clean disappearance on the display and a brief flash visible from the flight deck. The second interceptor guided on the next target and destroyed it moments later. But the third contact, the one that had been flickering, did not behave like the others. It was smaller, faster in its jinks, and it did not hold a steady approach line.
It weaved. It dropped.
It reappeared on a slightly different bearing each time the radar swept past.
Drone.
The assessment came from an EW console. Small UAV profile. Possible terminal guidance relay or decoy. Either way, it is drawing fire. That was the problem. If the strike group spent an interceptor on a cheap drone, that was a missile they did not have for whatever came next. If they ignored it, the drone might be providing terminal guidance data to something they had not yet detected.
The TAO made the call. Ignore the drone.
Focus on anything with an anti-ship profile. If it is a relay, kill the thing it is relaying to. The fourth contact resolved the question. At 5:50, it emerged from behind the drone's clutter shadow with sudden clarity.
Larger signature. Faster.
Locked on an intercept course that pointed directly at Lincoln's port quarter. This was the real threat. The drone had been masking it. Track 4 is the primary. CIC called across the net. Profile consistent with anti-ship cruise missile. Terminal phase. Solving on Lincoln. Everything after that happened in a compressed window that felt like 30 seconds and lasted perhaps 90. The nearest escort fired. The interceptor raced out and began solving on the inbound. Lincoln's own electronic warfare systems activated in full, pumping out deception and noise designed to seduce the missile seeker away from the carrier's massive radar signature. Chaff bloomed from launchers along the carrier's superstructure, creating clouds of reflective material that hung in the humid air like metallic fog. The inbound wavered. For one brief, measurable moment, its track shifted. The seeker had tasted the deception. It began to drift, then it corrected. The missile's guidance was good enough, or its programming was robust enough, to reject the false target and reacquire the real one.
The track steadied. It was still coming.
The escort's interceptor arrived 3 seconds later. The engagement happened so close to the surface of the Gulf that sailors on Lincoln's sponsons saw the flash before they heard it. A violent white detonation erupted off the port quarter, low enough that the spray column it produced reached nearly the height of the nearest escort's mast. Burning debris scattered across the water in a fan pattern that extended dangerously close to the formation. One fragment line arced wide enough that a piece of material, unidentifiable from the flight deck, struck the water less than 200 meters from Lincoln's hull. The missile was dead, but the margin had been measured in seconds and meters, not miles. On the bridge, no one spoke for a moment. Then the captain's voice, unchanged in pitch or volume from his first order of the morning.
Confirm kill.
Assess battle damage to the screen.
Report any new tracks.
CIC swept the picture. The drone was still airborne but appeared to have lost its link. It wandered aimlessly for several seconds before beginning a slow descent toward the water. No new inbound tracks appeared. The southern emission that had been coordinating the second wave went silent. The western emitter had not reappeared.
The attack was over.
2 waves, 7 or more weapons launched, multiple axes of approach, decoys, drones, coordination emissions, and a final missile that had nearly solved its way to the largest warship in the formation.
All of it defeated, none of it comfortable.
In CIC, the transition from defense to offense began without a formal announcement. It began because the people in the room had already been collecting the data they needed. Every radar track, every emission, every timing interval, every bearing line from both waves had been recorded, tagged, and stored. The electronic warfare team had been building a map of the launch network since before the first missile appeared. Now that map was nearly complete. The strike warfare commander laid it out for the captain at 6:04. The picture showed a distributed network stretching along the western threat axis and curving south toward the second wave's origin. Coastal radar nodes that had provided early cueing. Relay points that had carried coordination signals. Mobile launch elements positioned in terrain that offered concealment and rapid displacement. A command node that appeared to have synchronized the timing between the two waves. It was not a single launcher sitting on a hillside. It was a system, designed to be dispersed, designed to survive partial destruction, designed to be difficult to target with a single strike. The captain studied the picture for less than a minute. Then he authorized the response. On the flight deck, aircraft that had been held during the defensive phase were now the centerpiece of the next one. Super Hornets moved into launch position with weapons already loaded. Growlers, the electronic warfare variants, were spotted behind them, carrying pods designed to blind, confuse, and strip away the electronic coherence of exactly the kind of network the intelligence picture described. The air wing was not launching a symbolic gesture. It was launching a systematic dismantlement. The first catapult shot sent an F divided by a -18E screaming off the bow at 6:09. The second followed 18 seconds later. Growlers launched after them, climbing into the Gulf haze with the quiet lethality of aircraft whose primary weapon is not a bomb but the ability to make the enemy deaf and blind at the worst possible moment. The strike package sorted itself over the strait and turned toward the coast. Inside CIC, controllers managed the deconfliction between outbound strike aircraft and the still active defensive posture of the escorts below. The strike group could not afford to assume the fight was over. Hormuz does not allow that assumption. So the formation maintained its defensive geometry while simultaneously feeding targeting data to the aircraft now racing toward the origin points of the attack. The Growlers went to work first. Their electronic attack began degrading the network before a single weapon was released. The coastal radar node that had provided early warning to the launch chain started producing garbled returns. Its emissions stuttered, spiked with interference, then dropped to a fraction of their normal power. A relay point that had been carrying coordination signals between the command element and the mobile launchers lost coherence entirely. Operators ashore who had been passing timing data were suddenly transmitting into noise. Then the strikes landed. The first target was the radar cueing site. A precision-guided weapon struck the facility with the kind of accuracy that leaves a crater where equipment used to be and nothing recognizable around it. The strike aircraft confirmed. Target 1 effective. No secondary explosions, which suggested the site had been primarily electronic rather than storing munitions. The second target was different. The mobile launch support element had been identified through a combination of radar backtrack data and thermal signatures captured by surveillance assets during the attack. The strike caught it in the process of attempting to displace. The weapons hit while vehicles were still moving, which produced the secondaries that confirmed the intelligence had been correct. Fuel, propellant, support equipment, all of it contributing to a column of smoke visible from the returning aircraft for minutes afterward. A third target, the suspected command node, was struck simultaneously by a separate element of the package. Post-strike assessment showed disrupted communications, abandoned positions, and the kind of scattered debris pattern that indicates a facility hit during active operations rather than after evacuation. The returning aircraft crossed back over the formation at 6:38. Recovery operations began immediately. Deck crews who had launched the strike now caught the aircraft with the same efficiency, trapping jets aboard, chaining them down, beginning the turnaround process that would make them available again if needed. Because in Hormuz, the need never fully disappears. By 6:45, the tactical summary was being compiled. It would eventually read as a spare, clinical document. Timestamps, bearings, engagement sequences, weapons expended, target struck, battle damage assessed. It would not capture the sound of the close-in weapon system spooling aboard an escort. It would not record the way debris from the final intercept splashed close enough to Lincoln to darken the water off her port quarter. It would not describe the expression on the face of a flight deck sailor who watched a missile die 200 meters from the ship he was standing on and then went back to directing aircraft 30 seconds later. What the summary would capture was this: a coordinated multi-axis attack by Houthi-affiliated forces employing anti-ship cruise missiles, decoys, drone relays, and a distributed coastal launch network had been directed at USS Abraham Lincoln during a strait transit. The strike group's layered defense had intercepted all inbound threats. The carrier had sustained no damage. The response strike had degraded the launch network responsible for the attack, destroying or disabling its primary nodes within approximately 40 minutes of the last defensive engagement. The formation had not diverted. It had not slowed. It had not requested permission or waited for deliberation from a headquarters thousands of miles away. It had absorbed the attack, killed the threats, identified the source, and dismantled it while continuing to transit one of the most strategically significant waterways on the planet. For the network that had spent weeks preparing that morning's operation, the result was not merely failure. It was exposure. The emissions, the timing, the relay architecture, all of it had been collected, catalogued, and fed into a targeting process that erased the infrastructure faster than it could be reconstituted. The next attempt, if there was one, would start from a deficit. Fewer nodes, fewer relay points, less confidence that the coordination signals would not be intercepted before the first missile ever left its rail. At 6:52, Lincoln pushed through the eastern mouth of the strait and into the wider waters of the Gulf of Oman. Behind her, the escorts reformed their standard transit geometry. Radars continued to sweep. Weapons systems remained at elevated readiness. The flight deck began the methodical process of resetting for the next cycle, because there was always a next cycle. The strait behind them was quieter than it had been an hour earlier. Not peaceful. Hormuz is never peaceful, but quieter in the specific way that a place becomes quiet when the thing that had been building inside it has been spent, answered, and broken apart before it could achieve what it was designed to do. The carrier moved on. The water closed behind it. And somewhere along the coast, in the wreckage of what had been a functioning attack network, the silence was not calm. It was the sound of a miscalculation settling into the ground. The aircraft carrier was already burning. Not the kind of fire that kills a ship. Not yet. A single compartment, portside, midships, where a 330-pound warhead had just punched a hole the size of a garage door through the hull plating of the USS Vela Gulf. But we are getting ahead of ourselves by about 9 minutes. Rewind. The Strait of Hormuz is not a waterway. It is a political statement disguised as geography. 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest, squeezed further by international shipping lanes into a corridor roughly 6 miles across. It is the passage through which 17 million barrels of oil move every single day. 1/5 of the world's petroleum supply slides through this crack in the coastline between Iran and Oman, and every barrel of it passes within visual range of Iranian military installations that have been staring at this water since 1979. Into this corridor, on a morning when the sea state was 2 feet and the wind was negligible, the United States Navy pushed 100,000 tons of sovereign territory. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, CVN-69, a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, 1,092 feet from bow to stern, drawing almost 40 feet of water, moving at 5 knots through the most watched stretch of ocean on the planet. 5 knots. A brisk walking pace. A speed that makes sense when you are managing the thermal signatures of 2 A4W nuclear reactors and coordinating with a formation of escorts spread across several miles of sea, but a speed that also means anything faster than a rowing boat can run you down. The Eisenhower was not alone. She never is. 3 miles to the north, the guided missile cruiser USS Vela Gulf, CG-72, a Ticonderoga-class ship carrying the Aegis combat system and 96 vertical launch cells loaded with a cocktail of SM-2 surface-to-air missiles and Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. 3 miles to the southeast, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Gravely, DDG-107, carrying the same Aegis system, the same launch cells, and 2 phalanx close-in weapon systems that could spit 20mm tungsten rounds at 4,500 rounds per minute. Together the 3 ships represented roughly $4.6 billion of American military engineering. The flight deck alone, 4.5 acres of non-skid coated steel, held 44 F divided by a -18 E and F Super Hornets, 5 EA, 18G Growler electronic warfare jets, and enough ordnance in the magazines below to flatten a mid-sized city. 2 nuclear reactors hummed beneath the waterline, reactors that would not need refueling for 20 years. 5,000 sailors ate breakfast, stood watch, maintained aircraft, and went about the mundane business of operating a floating airfield in hostile waters. And 72 hours before any of this, before the carrier had even entered the Gulf, the transit plan had been filed with 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, 350 nautical miles to the southwest. Every detail coordinated. Every contingency briefed. A carrier transit through Hormuz is a choreographed event, rehearsed and refined over decades of repetition. The Navy has been driving carriers through this strait since the 1980s. They have it down to a science. The problem with science is that the other side studies it too. 11 nautical miles northeast of the Eisenhower's projected track, in a sun-bleached fishing port called Bandar-e Jask, the morning began differently. Jask sits at the eastern mouth of the strait, a cluster of concrete piers that normally hosts 30 to 40 small dhows and fishing skiffs. At 6:20 local time, 27 minutes before the Eisenhower would enter the narrowest section of the channel, the first boats started leaving. They left in pairs. Quiet departures, separated by 30 to 60 seconds, slipping out of the harbor mouth and turning southwest. Pecan-class fast inshore attack craft, 46 feet long, powered by twin diesel waterjet engines capable of 52 knots. Ashura-class boats, Smaller, lighter, faster in a straight line. And mixed among them, civilian rigid hull inflatables that had been modified in ways that would not be obvious until you were close enough to see the welded weapons mounts on their bows. The Pekin carries a crew of 3 and either 2 Nor anti-ship cruise missiles or a single 324mm torpedo tube. The Nor is a derivative of the Chinese C-802, a sea-skimming anti-ship missile with a range of 22 miles and a 330-pound warhead that arrives at its target traveling 680 miles per hour, roughly Mach 0.98, at an altitude of 15 feet above the wave tops. Each Pekin costs approximately $500,000. Each Nor missile, roughly $200,000. Numbers that would not buy a single engine on one of the Super Hornets parked on the Eisenhower's flight deck. The Ashura-class boats carried no missiles at all. Some had DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine guns. Some had rocket-propelled grenades. 3 of them carried nothing but outboard engines and speed. Their purpose was not to kill anything. Their purpose was to be there, to fill the radar screen with contacts, to make every targeting decision aboard every American ship take 4 or 5 seconds longer than it should. In a fight measured in minutes, those seconds are the weapon. 16 miles to the west of Jask, a second cluster of boats launched from a concealed inlet near Kustak, then a third group from further west. The swarm was assembling itself across a front of almost 30 miles, converging on the shipping lanes from multiple bearings, and it was doing so in vessels that cost roughly $25,000 apiece. The entire Iranian attack fleet approaching that morning, all 60 boats, totaled approximately $1.5 million. About what it costs to fly a single training sortie for a single Super Hornet. Here is what the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy understood about American carrier operations, and it is worth pausing on this because the entire engagement turns on it. The IRGCN does not train to sink aircraft carriers. No one in Tehran believes 60 fiberglass speedboats are going to put a 100,000-ton nuclear warship on the bottom of the Strait of Hormuz. That is not the plan. That has never been the plan. The plan is to create a decision crisis. A carrier strike group operating in confined waters under rules of engagement that require positive identification before weapons release is a system that runs on information. The CIC, the Combat Information Center aboard the Eisenhower, processes hundreds of contacts simultaneously, classifying each one, assigning threat levels, tracking bearing, speed, and course. It is extraordinarily good at this. But it is good at this against the threats it was designed to face. Cruise missiles flying at known profiles. Aircraft squawking identifiable transponder codes. Submarines moving at predictable speeds through predictable water. 60 fiberglass boats with radar cross-sections smaller than a pelican, moving at 60 miles per hour through waters already crowded with 200 to 400 civilian contacts, are not the threat the system was optimized for. The boats do not need to penetrate the defense. They need to overwhelm the decision cycle. And every sailor in that CIC knows, with a precision that borders on genetic memory, what happened the last time an American warship in this strait made a targeting decision too fast. Iran Air Flight 655, July 1988. The cruiser USS Vincennes misidentified an Airbus A300 civilian airliner climbing on a known commercial flight path and fired 2 SM-2 missiles. 290 people died. That incident is not a footnote in the rules of engagement. It is the rules of engagement. Every classification, every identification, every decision to shoot or not shoot runs through the filter of that memory. The IRGCN commander orchestrating this operation from a hardened bunker 8 miles inland from Bandar Abbas understood this. He had designed his attack not around the physics of warheads and hull plating, but around the psychology of a 5,000-person crew trained to be terrified of making a mistake. At 0651 local time, the Eisenhower CIC logged 14 new surface contacts emerging from the eastern shoreline. 4 minutes later, the count was 23. By 0658, it was 41. Every one of them headed southwest into the shipping lanes at speeds between 35 and 52 knots. The watch officer had a classification problem that was getting worse by the second. But here is where the story bends in a direction the IRGCN commander did not anticipate. 45 minutes before his first boats had cleared the harbor at Jask, a U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft had been flying a racetrack pattern at 28,000 feet, 140 nautical miles to the southwest. The Poseidon carries the AN/APS-154 Advanced Airborne Sensor, a synthetic aperture radar capable of imaging surface contacts at ranges exceeding 200 nautical miles with resolution fine enough to count the outboard engines on a fishing boat. At 0601 local time, the Poseidon crew had transmitted a complete surface picture of every harbor along the Iranian coast to 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Every boat catalogued, every pier photographed. The baseline was set. When the boats began moving at 6:20, the departure was tracked in near real time by a second asset already on station. An MQ-4C Triton, the Navy's high-altitude unmanned surveillance aircraft, wingspan 131 feet, cruising at 56,000 feet, 190 nautical miles to the south. The Tritons and ZPY-3 multifunction active sensor had been painting the Iranian coastline continuously for 11 hours. It had watched the boats being loaded. It had watched the crews arrive.